Man, that water bottle. So, a couple of announcements before we get into our class this morning. And the first of those, Joe's going to actually make. So, Joe.
Only two made it through yesterday. They're not flying out via American. Some of them have, three have got flights out of Birmingham today, and others. All in the air right now. They hope to make worship this evening, but it's got to go. So keep that whole group in your prayers. There's a lot of stress.
A lot of stress. Okay. Some of you probably saw this lesson coming. Well, some people saw this lesson coming and signed up to go to Honduras, is what happened. Because of the nature of the topic, we are streaming, but we are not using mics. So let me repeat that. We are streaming, but the only person who's streaming is me. So you can feel free to make comments. Some of you are shaking your head no. Before we get started, let me just say that's why this subject needs to be talked about, because we're all scared about it. And it's an important one. We have some of our normal talkers gone and some of them teaching. I didn't do this great. I mean, I got my son teaching and my wife teaching, but my daughter's still in here. So, but she's used to me not holding back. So, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's start off with a prayer, and I'll lead us in that, and then we'll get into the subject. Great God, thank you so much for this morning and for the time to be together. We are mindful of our brothers and sisters who are on the way to do work in Honduras and to encourage those brethren and strengthen them. We know that the travel already has been tedious and it has been difficult, and we just pray for their safe arrival. We pray that if it's possible, they could be there tonight in order to worship with the brethren there, and that they'll have a great week. We look forward to hearing about all the things that they're able to accomplish this week to your glory. We pray that you will bless them. Bless us this morning. Be with me as a teacher and help me to say things in a way that is honest and true, but also respectful of the moment. Help us to strengthen our marriages. Help us to make sure we understand this is a biblical topic we need to talk about, one that you've not only endorsed, but you created us for this, and help us to understand that and leave with a better appreciation today about this subject. We ask all this in your son's name. Amen. Okay, first off, the easy one. What's romance? That's an easy one, right? Nobody? What's romance? What? Chemistry? So it's just a formula? Math? Biochemistry, Joe says, you're right, it's biochemistry. How's that biochemistry? It's all up in the head? Okay. Chemicals in your brain? Okay. What's a non-scientific definition of romance? What? Fun times? Flowers, is what you said? Hearts and flowers. What'd you say? Infatuation. Wow. Stacy? Making somebody feel cherished and special? Okay. Okay? All right? Somebody once said romance is what my husband did before we got married. Right? I mean, are things a little different once you get married? Oh, yeah, Charlie says. Are things a lot different once you're married and have kids? Yeah. And part of that, right or wrong, fair or unfair, before we're married, why do guys especially go overboard in the romance department before they're married? Trying to win her heart. You know, here's how dating works, right? When you're dating, women will get up at 4:30 in the morning to be ready to leave the house by 6 to go fishing all day because they love him. Men will get dressed up and go to the symphony because they love her. What happens when you get married? You find out he hates the symphony and she hates fishing. Suddenly, now that you're married, you don't do all those things anymore. Now, is that how it should work? No. But there is a courting process in the dating span of your relationship that is far more intense. It is far more intentional than after you're married. Because after all, once you're married, and by the way, our faith makes this worse. Once you're married, you're stuck. You're stuck. I mean, have you ever jokingly said to your wife or your husband, well, you're stuck with me? Anybody ever joke? I've said that. You've never jokingly told? Listen, I was going to be honest with you. There's some times in our life that wasn't even a joke. You're stuck with me. We got to work through this. And I know that has a negative connotation, but there's a truth to that. Now, because of that, though, sometimes I think we're even worse at this romance thing because we have this firm belief that once you're married, it's for life. And since it's for life, well, now I can just kind of be me. You know, I don't have to sneak out of bed and brush my teeth before I say hello. You get me bad breath, bad hair, bad everything, right? And that's the key to all this is we got to think through this. You need to date after you're married, by the way. You need to date after you're married. Before we go further, let me say about the book. I think there's a lot of good things in the book. I think there's a lot of things that the book doesn't present in the way that is maybe best. I think there's some things that need to be talked about the book doesn't touch on. And because I feel that way, we're probably going to add to the book more than base everything on the book. Some of that's cultural. Some of that's generational. I'm friends with the writers of the book. They're older than me. And I think that creates sometimes a difference in approach. There is something, too, by the way, to the generations, the millennials, the Zs, the Xs, the boomers, and the differences. That's more than just funny stuff. There's real things to that, and we view things differently, we look at things differently, and I think sometimes we understand things differently, sometimes better, sometimes not so much better, but it's important to kind of think differently. So I carry that worldview and a need here. So as we start, the second question is, how are romance and sex connected? How are they connected? Well, you can. There's a lot of people who do. That's why Tinder exists, by the way. Let's just be honest about it, okay? But how are romance and sex connected? I mean, theoretically, we think of romance as the way to sex. And by we, I mean males. When you see, by the way, life is different when you have girls because anytime a girl that is your daughter talks to a guy, then as a father, you become very overprotective. Why is that? You know what? You know how guys think. Charlie? Y'all just want to nerd out in science class this morning. Chemistry and biology. Next it'll be physics, an object at never mind. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Okay? Okay? Right? Okay? As a dad, when my daughter is dating somebody, she's not yet, but and I see a guy romancing her, is that going to give me concern as a dad? Why? Right. Because guys use romance to get to sex until they're married. Isn't that funny? Think about what I just said. When you're dating, guys, I've got John just a minute. Guys use romance to get to sex, and then you get married, and we've already established the romance stops. And that's why they're connected. John? There's exceptions. Let me say this, and this is where culture is changing. Because of the internet and because of pornography and because of sex that is unattached and unromantic, there's a generation of females that are breaking those cultural standards. Those things are not, those typical, traditional gender stereotypes are going to somewhat be redefined in the years to come. Okay? When I was growing up, men were the aggressors, girls were not. Now, and you see this if you spend time around young people, it is not unusual to see aggressive females. Whether it's asking guys out, whether it's asking a guy to marry them, which becomes more popular and happens a lot more often than you think, or if it's just indecent proposals from females to males. That is becoming more popular, more normal, more common. But as a general rule, yes, what is said is true. Generally speaking, men, and there's been sociological studies that have shown men think about sex like every 15 seconds, at least in the prime of their life, and women do not, generally speaking, okay? Moving on, when you hear the word sex, what's your reaction to that? What is it? What is it, Eric? What's your reaction? What is it? What is it? Okay, yeah, right. We're numb to it? Okay. Yep, since the sexual revolution, Landry? Dirty connotation, okay? Without romance? Okay. All right. Yeah. I was going to say, I was waiting for one of the guys to go, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, we're numb to it. We're numb to it. Yeah. What about when you hear the word sex in church? That's when we tighten up a little bit. Like, admit it, how many of you are a little uncomfortable this morning? Yeah, because we don't talk about this stuff in church. It's funny because God talked about it quite a bit. Yeah. I mean, we're going to read some of that this morning. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, listen, we are so, historically in religious circles, we are so uncomfortable with sex. You know what we did with Song of Solomon years ago? We turned it into this 3-person allegory about Christ and the church because that's how uncomfortable we were about it. And you may hold on to that view if you want, but I do not. Here's my view of Song of Solomon. It's 2 people that are crazily in lust and love for each other, and it's God's book to show you how a husband and wife should feel about each other's not only love, but physical sex. That book is filled with sexual connotation. And if you look at the chiastic structuring of the book, we'll look at that in a minute. I'll show you what that is. There's no doubt what the book is about. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would tell you that, Charlie, I don't think that parents are presenting, I don't think they're aware of those things. I don't think that's a cognizant decision. I think it goes back to what was said earlier. We are so numb to this concept and this idea, and we're so numb to the idea of sexual attraction and what that is, that is not, I don't think it's a conscious decision. Yeah, it's just, yeah, this is just who we are. We have lost to a degree, we have lost our sense of shame in our ability to blush in this area. But here's a problem. Part of the problem there is, as a reaction to generations of saying this is something you don't talk about, we had the sexual revolution that pushed the envelope in an extremist reaction, when what we should have been doing is having classes like this occasionally to talk about what godly sex in the marriage bed is about. That's what's missing. And it may make you uncomfortable, but that's why we have to have classes like this and conversations like this. I want to talk about, okay, what were you taught about sex growing up? By the way, the B is intentional there, right? Marriage bed's undefiled. Progressive parents, if that's what they taught you. My dad was a scientist. He was a microbiologist. He worked in a hospital. I got a book, a very, very detailed book about your body is going through these changes, and here's what it all means. But you know what? The reality is I learned about sex in 6th grade from a guy that sat next to me in class. That's what I learned about sex about. I mean, because I didn't read all the book, right? And 10 ways to please a woman, probably. Yeah, I got that down. My grandmother, I used as a kid, I'd frustrate my mom, true story, by asking my grandmother about sex. I thought it was funny. It was. The same grandmother that said marriage is for life. And I said, what do I need to know about sex? And she described it this way, that it was the wife's job to lay there and let the husband mess all over her. That's what I was taught about sex from my grandmother. My mom, by the way, hates that story. Hope she's awake and streaming just for that. Listen, here's one of the problems about sex today, though. We have done damage to our children by not talking about it and by talking about it in bad ways. We have caused unnecessary hardship in the relationship of our children, whether future or present, because we have said things, especially to our daughters, like, sex is dirty. Sex is nasty. And we have created this paradigm, and this was more popular, I think, years ago, that sex is this dirty, awful, nasty thing you have to endure for procreation. And so she gets married and she loves a guy. And what you have to understand is, as John says, the guy thinks about sex 8 days a week. And her response is, that's dirty, that's nasty, that's gross, that's only for procreation. What happens as a result of that is you have huge turmoil in your marriage. And a lot of it goes back to the way we talk about it to our kids. Listen, there are ways to teach your child the value of abstinence without acting like sex is gross. That's important to understand. When you get married, though, right? Yeah. Right. Yep. Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And every parent's going to have to handle that themselves. Okay? Understand that. But if you don't talk to your kids about it, their friends will. And by the way, I don't care how you educate your kids. You can homeschool your kids. You take them to a co-op and you've not talked to them about it, your kids are still going to hear about it from their friends at the co-op. Because I know stories where that's happened. It is going to happen. You need to, as she says, be ahead of the game. It is going to happen, okay? And the other thing is, you need to have a sex-healthy environment in your house. Like, don't act like you don't have sex because your kids are around. Like, don't lead your kids to believe, I got 3 kids. My kids know it. We didn't just do this 3 times, right? You have to be open and honest about it. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. Okay, I want to talk for just briefly. This is something that's in the book, but not really. There are some barriers in the bedroom, especially today, that we just have to discuss. One of those, the first of those, is your past experience. There's a couple different ones. One of them is pornography. Listen, pornography is a problem in the church. It's my generation and lower. We didn't have to sneak out to the gas station or to the bookstore to look at magazines. We could look at it on our computers and our phones. Our parents didn't know anything about it. And the reality is, 3 out of every 4 guys my age or younger has probably viewed pornography to some extent on their computer or the digital devices. And if they don't tell you that's true, they're probably lying. That creates a whole host of problems. Pornography is void of romance. It is unconnected, no strings attached sexual gratification. It builds up a dopamine response in you when you watch it that you will then desire and crave like a drug. And it doesn't require a connection in order to get it. Unlike sex, which, by the way, here's a little secret, is work because you got to work to stay connected. That's why stress becomes a problem. We'll talk about that in a moment. Pornography creates this pathway to get your dopamine hit without work. And it also develops an unrealistic expectation about what sex is. You take a teenage boy who grows up watching pornography, he gets married to the good Christian girl you want him to. She is not going to do the things that he has learned in his head are sex, and not in the ways she does them. And then you spend a lot of time where you have this young man who's grown up through pornography, finding that this is what it's going to be like, and you have this young lady who's not done any of that and who's been told it's awful and gross and smelly and terrible. You put them two together, and what happens? It is a clashing of different worlds. And what that creates is many nights of anger and frustration because they're not on the same page. That's just as pure and honest and blunt as I can be. Second, sexual abuse and trauma. I think it's 1 out of every 4 females at one time had been sexually assaulted, molested, groped in public, something along those lines. The reality is she's going to bring that trauma to her marriage. Is going to be problematic. And in most cases, it's going to be something that's not talked about, that's suppressed and hidden for a long time. And that causes problems. A lot of problems. By the way, if any of those two right there, most cases need some counseling. Okay? And professional counseling, not me. Professional, especially the second one up there. Oh, yeah. Men too, no doubt. Men too. I'm just, the women, again, more common in one than the other, but happens in both. And I think that will change too because of this sexual explosion through the internet. We talked about past teaching concerning sex. Here's a big one, body dysmorphia, which is a more modern term, but especially, by the way, I think among females, which body dysmorphia is just how she views her body. And I think that's one of the reasons why Song of Solomon, what we're going to look at in a minute, is really powerful. We'll talk about how that's an answer to body dysmorphia. But the chances are, especially the older your wife gets, the more unhappy she gets with something about her body, as a general rule. And husbands, you are the greatest tool to respond to that. Stress. Stress is a huge barrier. And that could be a lot of things, but if you're depressed, if you've got a lot of work going on, if you've got any kind of mental issues going on, medication can include and be involved in this, will create situations where it becomes a barrier to your sexual relationship. Just does. That's all there is to it. And there's probably more we could put in there, but I think those are the most common. Now, marital problems would be on there as well, but really this whole class we've been hitting away at that. We're going to assume that we've addressed a lot of those issues before we get to this point. But that'll be stress too. Joe? Mm-hmm. It was in a tent, but yes. Yeah. Well, and then I guess we could further go off of that and just remind us that in first century Jewish culture, we probably all can be considered harlots, or a great majority of people, just because of the sexual promiscuity before marriage, which is way different than back then. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. 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 It needs to be a balanced approach to the parenting, for sure. Okay. What is the purpose of sex? Procreation? I mean, here's part of the problem with this. There's probably not one purpose. If we say procreation, then what do we say to the barren person that don't have sex? See, I knew when I put that up there, I should have hidden that one question. Should sex be pleasurable? Yeah. I think ultimately it's a lot of things. I think number one, there is an intimate connection you experience between husband and wife that is vital and integral to your relationship. Now, that should be pleasurable, and that can result in procreation under the right circumstances. The reason why this question is important is because for years, the Catholic Church taught what? Sex was just for procreation, and it's not for pleasure. And I just think that the Bible disagrees with that, okay? Let's talk about the marriage bed. It's already been mentioned. The marriage bed is undefiled in Hebrews 13 and verse 4, okay? The marriage bed is undefiled. Any other bed is defiled, but the marriage bed is undefiled. The question always comes up, well, then what does that mean you can do? Okay? This is where Terry's blunt. You can do anything that both of you agree to do alone, together, meaning the two of you. Nobody else. The two of you agree to do. In full agreement, both of you, by the way. Both of you. That's how that works. I had a friend illustrate it one time this way. Imagine that you and your wife get to go to Six Flags. You're the only two in the park. You can ride any ride you want as many times as you want, as long as you both agree to ride it together. But you're the only two in the park. That's the easiest way there. You got to agree. There's got to be a full agreement together, okay? So we'll move on from that. Secondly, it's a covenant. It's an agreement between you and ultimately between God. But 1 Corinthians 7 is important here. We don't normally view this as a covenant, but that's what's going on here. In verse 1, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Verse 2, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Here, Paul puts it in this context of there is a responsibility for you to meet this need of your mate, of your spouse. Keep going. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps for agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. First off, let me deal with verse 5. Verse 5 is a fast, is what that is. We talk about fasting, often we think about not eating, but in verse 5, what he's talking about is a sexual fast. That you could fast from the sexual relation for a period of time to devote yourself to prayer, and at the end of that time, come back and reconnect in that relationship. That's all that is. What this passage is saying, though, is sex is not a manipulative tool to be used in your relationship. It's not something you hold over each other's heads. It's not something that you control each other with. It's something you give to each other in this covenant. You make part of your marriage covenant is making the covenant, I will be the one who satisfies you for the rest of your life. It's part of the covenant. Okay? But there's a reciprocity here that you're both in agreement with things. Right? And so you sit there and go, well, my wife said no, and it says there she can't say no. No, that's not what it says. It says that you are in agreement with each other. You've made this covenant. And then finally, it should be pleasurable. Let's start in Proverbs 5. Proverbs 5, here in this instructions to the king's son, starting in verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Now, he's not talking about water. He's talking about the sexual relationship. And he's talking about, here it's this, in this section, staying away from the harlot, not going to her house. And he comes down here and says, drink from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Drink at home. In verse 16, should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, don't go throw your water around the town. Keep it at home. Okay? Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Just for the two of you. Nobody else. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Nothing in there is about recreation, procreation. It's about pleasure. Let me tell you one of the things about this passage real quick. Let your wife's breast satisfy you at all times. Men, you should only be pleased by your wife's breast, whether that's through touching or looking. Only your wife's. Don't look at other women's breasts. You have a wife. Hers are the one that give you pleasure the rest of your life. There's also an implication, women, you don't share yours with anybody else either. Through touch or appearance. Therefore, your husband. But there's pleasure here. And if there weren't pleasure here, then turn over to Song of Solomon. And we could read a lot, but let's look at chapter 5. Look starting in verse 10. Here's what's interesting to me about chapter 5 and verse 10. By the way, in the three-person allegory, this is one of my problems with it. Got to say this quick, we've only got about 5 minutes. There's this whole thing about Solomon and the Shunammite woman and the shepherd boy. And what ends up happening there is you read passages about Solomon talking about her, and you're like, he's just this dirty old man who's lusting after this girl. Listen to what she says about her beloved, starting in verse 10. My beloved is radiant and ruddy, distinguished among 10,000. His head is the finest gold. His locks are wavy, black as a raven. His eyes are like doves beside streams of water, bathed in milk, sitting beside a full pool. His cheeks are like beds of spices, mounds of sweet-smelling herbs. His lips are lilies, dripping liquid myrrh. By the way, we're just looking at his face right now. So we get down to about his throat. Not too bad. Keep reading what she says. His arms are rods of gold set with jewels. His body is polished ivory, bedecked with sapphires. Do I need to tell you what the sapphires are? There's 2 of them on his chest. His legs are alabaster columns set on bases of gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as the cedar. His mouth is most sweet. He is altogether desirable. This is my beloved. This is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. Let me tell you something. That ain't some pure little Shunammite girl. That's dripping with lust. She is categorizing his body and talking about it like an object almost. I mean, if this was said about somebody outside of a relationship in our world today, we would talk about the objectification. This is a man towards a woman of how she's looking. She's doing that to her beloved. Now, he does the same thing in chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. By the way, their language is weird. It's more weird for the woman. I get that. But you got to understand that what's going on here. Starting in verse 1, how beautiful are your feet in sandals, O noble daughter. Your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of a master hand. Your navel is a rounded bowl that never lacks mixed wine. Your belly is a heap of wheat encircled with lilies. Your 2 breasts are like fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is an ivory tower. Your eyes are pools in Heshbon by the gate of Bath-rabbim. Your nose is like a tower of Lebanon which looks towards Damascus. Your head crowns you like Carmel. Your flowing locks are like purple. A king is held captive in the tresses. How beautiful and pleasant you are, O loved one, with all your delights. I mean, they're both looking at each other's body and going all over it and saying, I love the way this looks. I love every part about you. You want to know how to deal with body dysmorphia in your home? This is it. As a husband, tell your wife the things you love about her body. And if you know there are things she hates, tell her why you like those very things. Reinforce she is beautiful to you. Listen. The reality is, as we get older, things happen. Gravity takes its course. Our bodies change. We don't stay in the same shape we once were. All that's going to happen. But you know what? We still should love our mate in this way. And this book is in here to encourage us to be open and honest about that with each other. By the way, I said earlier, if you look at the chiasm, of this, which means you parallel everything out, you come to the center point of the book, what is the most important part of Song of Solomon? It is this. Let my beloved come to his garden, eat its choicest fruit. I came to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gathered my myrrh with my spice. I ate my honey with a honeycomb. I drank my wine with my milk. Eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. The center point of this book is what was talked about earlier, the consummation of the marriage, where he goes in to his garden and he tastes of the garden and he finds out it tastes really good. And he says, you know what? You all should go home to your garden too and enjoy it. The focal point of Song of Solomon is enjoy your garden. And he's not talking about an actual garden. We're just out of time. Those would be great questions. Let me say this. If you're into podcasts, let me suggest a podcast for you. It's by a couple. I went to college with him. They are both faithful Christians. I think he's a deacon. He's a veterinarian. They're great about this subject. They do not, by the way, pull back. It is very blunt and honest, but it's also scriptural when it needs to be scriptural. It's technical when it needs to be technical. It's very practical. It's called, I think it's called Intimate Covenant. Intimate Covenant with Matt and Jen. And encourage you, if you're into that kind of thing, if you want to go into this deeper, to look into that. We're out of time. Kids are starting to come out. We don't want them to hear any of this. Thank you for your, participation to a degree today.